History repeats itself, a saying that has always been relevant throughout the generations. Mankind has always strived to be superior, yet many times when doing so, it has either hurt itself or created something morally questionable. Thus, history repeats itself. But, in the case of a certain unique creation at the hands of one of the wasteland's most technologically advanced organisations, you could say that rather than history repeating itself, history came back. That is a way you could describe someone who, in a sense, returned from the dead. And that someone is Nick Valentine. Before the bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077, a university in Cambridge, Massachusetts stood tall and proud, dedicated to educating in the field of technology. It was known as the Commonwealth Institution of Technology, or CIT for short. Great minds such as Robert House attended the university, and even after the Great War it continued to teach, study and thrive. A number of CIT personnel managed to survive the nukes by taking refuge in the underground level of the campus. It's not known what happened throughout the next 33 years, but in 2110, a new technological organisation arose from the battered remains of the CIT, founded by the survivors and/or their children, the Institute. The goal of this new faction was the further development of pre-war science. Over time, ignoring the chaotic outside world, various generations of scientists dug deeper into the earth below the CIT ruins, and carefully carved out a subterranean marvel consisting of incredibly sophisticated laboratories and habitats. In the early days, the Institute developed something unbelievable for a post-war creation: robotic androids, or as they are commonly known as, synths. These first-generation models had the physical capabilities of humans, yet they were no smarter than a Robco Protectron. The Institute, along with their new creations, emerged from their underground home and attempted to work peacefully with the people of the post-war Commonwealth, a division of the New England pre-war American state of Massachusetts. However, thanks to mutual mistrust, the relationship between the two societies came to an end, and the Institute continued on with their work, leaving the Commonwealth to its fate, and attempting to achieve their own vision for humanity, regardless of the cost. Eventually, the Institute managed to create a second generation of synths. These creations possessed upgraded mechanisms and programming, as well as obviously artificial skin to protect their internal components, and were given mechanical eyes, as opposed to the cameras of the Gen 1 synths. Although almost every Gen 2 synth is the same as another, there were two known second generation synths that were unique to their counterparts. These would act as one of the foundations that the Institute would build better and more advanced synths upon. They were prototypes, experiments to test how synthetic humans could handle independent thinking. They were the first synths capable of this independence. One was called Dima, and the other was who would become Nick Valentine. For many years the two synths were experimented on. Dima was allowed to develop his brain through experience, whereas Nick was used by the scientists to force a personality matrix into a synthetic brain. Every day Dima and likely Nick were strapped down while Institute personnel fiddled with pieces of their brains. After several failed attempts of imprinting a personality into Nick, they had finally succeeded. But Dima began to resent the experiments. He couldn't bear to see his fellow prototype, whom he called brother after supposedly developing a brotherly friendship, constantly waking up and not knowing who or what he was anymore. And so one day, the synth managed to escape the Institute with his brother in tow. Unfortunately, Thanks to the imprint and the fact that only so much memory can be stored in a prototype brain, Nick became confused and couldn't remember Dima. He had no idea what Dima was, and when his brother tried to help him, Nick attacked and the two engaged in a scuffle. Dima knocked his brother unconscious and left him there feeling as though he had lost him to the personality forced into his brain. Afterwards, Dima travelled to Mount Desert Island, now known simply as The Island, to escape the Institute's pursuit. He later went on to found Arcadia, a safe haven for escaped synths in a pre-war observatory atop a mountain on the island. The sole survivor from Vault 111 once travelled there to find a missing woman, and ended up meeting the old synth while doing so. However, it's not known whether or not Dima and Nick ever met again, though if they did, it would have probably been an interesting meeting. When Dima's brother awoke after the pair had escaped the Institute, he awoke as pre-war police detective Nick Valentine. Naturally confused, he awoke in a rubbish pile in Cambridge, the memories of the late detective fresh and alive in his mind. For several weeks, he wandered the wasteland in a confused state. Wastelanders treated him fairly, but with caution due to their unfamiliarity with the Institute and its technology at this time, possibly between the mid-2100s and early 2200s. Valentine's first human contact since waking up was a child possibly named Jim. Nick had wandered into a settlement and was questioned for an hour before he was considered friendly. Thus, the other inhabitants soon came out to gaze at the mechanical man. It was apparently quite the gathering, and the local mechanic freely gave Nick an inspection and repaired some of the damage he'd taken. Ever since that moment, he remembered the kindness of the people there, how they treated him as a human being, and the old synth tried to mirror that onto those he came across in his travels ever since. Eventually, Valentine left the small community, but years later returned to find it wiped off the map by raiders, though the fate of its people still remains a mystery. Nick continued to travel the wasteland and found himself heading into the great green jewel of the Commonwealth, Diamond City. Built up within Fenway Park, an old pre-war baseball venue, Diamond City was the place to be in the Commonwealth. Fortified, well-guarded, organised and prosperous, the settlement was appealing to all, and it's no surprise Nick found himself there, although the synth could not have found a worse time to enter the community. In 2229, the Broken Mask incident occurred. This was an event that brought about years of hatred for the Institute and their creations, regardless of a synth's allegiance. By 2227, work on the latest generation of synths was well underway in the Institute's laboratories. Over the years, people across the Commonwealth were disappearing. It turned out that the Institute was abducting people and bringing them down below CIT to be cattle for experiments. Tests involving the forced evolutionary virus, all resulting in super mutants appearing all over the Commonwealth for its people to deal with. With the successful abduction of a pre-war baby called Sean, the son of the sole survivor of Vault 111, came the successful creation of the third generation of synths. These were almost indistinguishable from natural-born humans, and the Broken Mask incident was the very first time a Gen 3 synth was encountered by the people of the Commonwealth. When Diamond City's popular dining spot Power Noodles was a bar run by a man called Henry, a man by the name of Carter entered town. Folk wanting to hear the news from outside the green wall flocked to him as he happily shared stories and drank with them. Yet, after a few hours passed, the smile on his face disappeared and his cheek began to twitch. Without warning, Carter pulled out a revolver and shot the barman Henry in the head. No emotion was seen on his face. Afterwards, he began shooting at others and ended up killing 3 or 4 more people before Diamond City security was able to put him down. The residents thought he was a man that went crazy, but upon closer inspection, they noticed the metal and plastic. Mr. Carter was a synth. He was an early Gen 3 prototype that malfunctioned and was not authorized to be out in the field. Ever since that day, the people of the Commonwealth realized that synths could look exactly like them and greatly feared the Institute. And all hope for the two societies to coexist, at least peacefully, was completely extinguished. Nick Valentine had arrived shortly after the Broken Mask incident, and had it not been for chance, he likely would have been shot on sight by the town's security. While wandering the wasteland, he stumbled upon a caravan trader and his companions. However, it turned out that they were a part of a gang of kidnappers and had an upset young teenage girl with them. As people didn't know a great deal about synths at the time, it was probably one of the easiest rescues in Nick's life. No shots were fired, no punches thrown. All the synth did was tell the gang he was rigged to explode and started going beep, beep, beep. The 4 men clambered to escape. All Nick had to do was try not to laugh as they ran. He managed to save the girl who turned out to be the missing daughter of Diamond City's mayor at that time, Henry Roberts. Upon arriving at the settlement with young Miss Roberts in tow, the mayor proclaimed Valentine a hero and offered him a home within the town's walls. Though the people objected to the mayor's decision to allow Nick to stay in Diamond City, he managed to settle in as the town's handyman, carrying out the jobs no one else wanted. But nobody ever forgot it was him who rescued the mayor's daughter. And when people went missing and needed finding, residents began coming to Nick for help. Over time, the synth stuck in the people's minds as whom they'd go to when someone needed finding, and thanks to the personality imprinted into his brain, Valentine inherited the excellent detective skills of the pre-war detective whose mind he was given back in the Institute. As a result, he had a knack for finding people. Work became so plentiful that he gave up being Diamond City's handyman and became its official private investigator. Though he never stopped being Nick the Synth, it was Nick the detective people wanted to see. Add this onto the fact that he never tried to hide what he was. People soon went from being content with his presence to welcoming it, and even liking him. After several months of detective work, Nick finally started charging for his services, and felt that he finally had a place he could truly call home. Nick Valentine put up his handyman clothes and traded them for a hat and a trench coat. Eventually, he opened up an official business, calling it Valentine's Detective Agency. He took on a secretary, Ellie Perkins, and eventually had a partner, a fellow called Marty Bullfinch, who ended up quitting after he and Nick didn't see eye to eye, and was apparently a drunk, often found on the barroom floor. He was later planning a job that would lead to the retrieval of a treasure known as the Gilded Grasshopper, a copper, gold and glass statue of a grasshopper located atop the Golden Dome of Faneuil Hall in Boston's financial district. Marty asked Nick to accompany him to the building and help retrieve this treasure, but for reasons unknown, Valentine never joined him, and so Bullfinch attempted the job alone. Marty braved the dangers of Faneuil Hall, and unfortunately died from fatal wounds on the rooftop, so close to his prize. This would be for Nick another case closed in the seemingly endless files of those opened, and was thanks to the efforts of the sole survivor that this part of Nick's life was tied up. However, this wouldn't be until the two first met, when the old synth got himself in a pickle that perhaps not even he could have gotten himself out of. At some point in 2287, Nick Valentine was hired by the parents of a young woman named Darla. It was thought that she'd been kidnapped, and so the synth detective scoured the ruins of Boston in search of her. His search took him to Vault 114, an unfinished vault located within Boston's Park Street metro station that was being used by an organised crime syndicate known as the Triggermen, and this particular group was being led by mobster boss Skinny Malone, who had an old rivalry with Nick. It was in Vault 114 that the detective discovered that Darla had not been kidnapped, but had become the latest addition to Skinny Malone's lineup of lovers. She was an angry, two-timing young woman and a lover of bad boys. She tried to encourage the gangster to kill old Nick once he was captured, but triggermen such as Malone seemed to operate with a code of honour. Thus, rather than kill him outright, and due to old times, the mob boss held Valentine captive for weeks. Although Nick was good at getting himself out of trouble, especially when it came to persuading others, it wasn't until he was rescued by none other than the sole survivor that he was free. But he wouldn't be truly free yet until he'd confronted his old rival. An irritated Malone appeared with Darla and more of his goons to confront Nick and his rescuer. Darla tried to press her lover into killing the synth and the vault dweller, but still Malone was hesitant, and had it not been for Darla, Nick wouldn't have even been there in the first place. Despite whatever exactly happened in that encounter, Nick and the sole survivor escaped. Detective Valentine was back home with a case closed and ready for a new one. Only the next one would be one of the most important cases in his entire career, as his client was the sole survivor searching for their son. The two sat down and began a discussion regarding the child and his kidnapper. After Nick analysed the situation, it was agreed that the Institute was the likely suspect, but they were the easiest to blame. When the sole survivor gave a description of one of their son's kidnappers that matched a figure Nick remembered, the name Kellogg came into discussion. He was a dangerous mercenary that bought a house in Diamond City and once lived there with a child of around 10 years old. The two ventured out to snoop around the house and confirm Nick's suspicions. Upon entering the residence, the pair found nothing of note, except for a button that opened up a concealed room. Within the room was everything a mercenary needed: food, stimpaks, weapons and ammo. But it was the unique cigars that caught the pair's attention. It was suggested that the sole survivor's dog, Dogmeat, could maybe pick up Kellogg's scent from the cigars. And that is exactly what he did. Dogmeat led the sole survivor to Fort Hagen on the western side of the Commonwealth. There they confronted the mercenary they searched high and low for, Conrad Kellogg. Afterwards, their search for the Institute began, and Nick suggested that the Diamond City reporter Piper Wright was probably the best bet in regards to investigating the Institute, specifically finding out where it is and how to get there. Unfortunately, their only lead, Kellogg, was dead, but the idea that they may only need the man's brains eventually came about. One of the major communities in the Commonwealth was Good Neighbour, home of ghouls, criminals and other peoples who didn't fit in elsewhere. There in the town was a place called the Memory Den, aptly named for the contraptions called memory lounges that the business contained. They allowed people to relive past memories as if they were happening there and then. It was run by a woman called Irma and a Dr. Amari. It was Amari that Nick and the sole survivor went to see about getting access to Kellogg's dead brain in order to find out anything useful regarding the Institute. Kellogg had a cybernetic brain augmenter embedded into his hippocampus, and the idea was to use Valentine as a conduit for the sole survivor to use in order to access Kellogg's memories. This more or less worked, yet it came with a side effect that may or may not have been permanent. When emerged from Kellogg's memories, the first thing Nick said to the sole survivor was in the voice of Kellogg, as if the mercenary had taken over his body and mind. Fortunately, since then, as far as is known, this was the first and last time such a thing happened. The sole survivor headed out to the glowing sea to continue on with their mission, and every now and then, Nick Valentine would accompany them in their travels, and eventually reveal that he was merely a copy of a pre-war detective. In his early days, Nick only remembered being in the Institute in a single test chamber, constantly monitored by someone. Then, as he described, he awoke on the other side, the desolate post-war world before him. However, at first, especially before Dima knocked him out when they escaped, the prototype synth thought that he was indeed a person from the days before the Great War. The real Detective Nick Valentine. Nick was a police detective from Chicago, Illinois, a part of the Great Midwest Commonwealth. In 2077, Captain Jonathan Widmark of the Boston Police Department established a task force whose goal was the investigation and capture of the notorious Boston crime boss, Edward Eddie Winter. Winter had been a problem for law enforcement for a while, engaging in illegal activities such as robbery and assassination. This prompted the creation and launch of an extensive investigation which would be known as Operation Winter's End. Detective Valentine was brought to Boston to act as lead detective in the operation. As the months of investigating went on, the extent of Winter's crimes were revealed, believed to have committed a vast number of offences on top of theft and murder. While attempting to bring down the Boston criminal kingpin, Valentine lost something he held dear, a wound that would not long after be worsened. Nick had a fiancée, a woman called Jennifer Lands, whose presence was unfortunately found out by Winter. In August that year, at a spot in South Boston overlooking the city's theatre and financial districts, Jennifer was shot in the back and killed, presumably for Nick's involvement in Operation Winter's End. After it was discovered by a federal bureau that Winter was in talks regarding Lands' whereabouts, the idea of placing both her and her fiancé in witness protection was suggested, but higher powers disregarded this in an effort to not compromise the ongoing investigations. Though not from the task force involved in the operation, but the Bureau of Alcohol, Drugs, Tobacco, Firearms and Lasers, BADTFL for short. 2 months later, Operation Winter's End was terminated. The task force disbanded, and the case against Eddie Winter was abruptly closed. The man went free. Captain Widmark was informed that Eddie had been cooperating with the BADTFL and handed over evidence that incriminated his associates. His lack of conviction was due to a deal he had made with the district attorney. Therefore, he was granted immunity from prosecution for his crimes. The loss of his beloved and the lack of Eddie's conviction left Nick Valentine with a long-lasting lust for vengeance. He was ordered by Widmark to seek treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder at the Commonwealth Institution of Technology, whom the Boston PD had been working with on a program to help deal with trauma, described as the scanning of brainwaves or some such. Nick attended the treatment at the CIT, and it was there his brain was scanned, and that was how the Institute obtained his memories. Although, it wasn't just the skills and personality of pre-war Valentine synth Nick obtained, it was also his emotions and memories, including that of Jennifer Lands and Eddie Winter, leading to Nick, with the help of the sole survivor, finally wrapping up this case over 200 years from when it first began. In due course, Nick opened up to the sole survivor about his memories from a long-dead pre-war detective, the real Nick Valentine. He explained that there was a piece of history he'd been hoping to tie up for a long while. He told them all about Eddie Winter and how even then, over 200 years later, there was still work to be done. Eddie, amongst others, could tell that the end of the pre-war world was coming and wanted to live forever. He invested a lot of money in a twisted radiation experiment that led him to being transformed into a ghoul, possibly the first ghoul. He then sheltered himself in a personal fallout shelter beneath a sub-shop he once used as a base for his operations. There Winter survived the Great War and had resided ever since. That was until an old enemy returned. And yet again, karma showed its existence. Valentine had been putting together a file about post-war Eddie over time, convinced he was still alive and in his little bunker. He knew his location and how to get to him, but the problem was that Eddie's shelter was sealed with a complex code locked door. But the Kingpin made a mistake in his past life. Winter made 10 holotape recordings that incriminated his associates, and on each of those tapes he hid a piece of the code, as a joke to show how stupid the Federal Bureau was. After all, it only took over 200 years for someone to crack it. Eventually, the sole survivor recovered 9 of these holotapes, the other already in Nick's possession. With the holotapes together, he figured out the code, and the pair proceeded to find and enter Eddie Winter's bunker. Surprisingly, the old crime boss was there, alive and ghoulish. Nick confronted Eddie, but as expected, the ghoul didn't recognize him, though he appeared familiar. Valentine reminded him of the real Nick and the murder of his fiancée, Jennifer, but Winter dismissed him for a robot copycat and showed no remorse for the killing of Lance. Along with the sole survivor, Nick avenged Jennifer and put Eddie down once and for all. Even though he knew Eddie's death wouldn't bring him closure, it didn't fix things as he thought it would. Right afterwards, the old synth showed the sole survivor the site where Jennifer Lance was killed. There he could call what he had just done, and all the good he tried to do, his own, not what belonged to the real Nick Valentine or even the Institute. He considered what he did to Eddie justice, and that his mission wasn't about anyone relevant, but about doing what's right. It is unknown what happened to the real Nick Valentine following his treatment at the CIT. All that Synth Nick could remember was going to the university and then waking up in a rubbish heap in the post-war world, a rude awakening as he once said. Presumably, Nick went back to his cases as Diamond City's private investigator. Whether his story is yet to be continued or is sadly over is unknown at this time. It cannot be said for definite what followed for Nick after the sole survivor and Eddie Winter, but what can be said is that in this wasteland of interesting people, Nick Valentine was certainly one of the most fascinating, attributed to what he is and the personality and memories given to him, even if they weren't his own. What Valentine teaches us is to be careful of what we do in our lives, for karma could always be watching, and may come back to bite, however unlikely. He also shows us that doing what is right, what is just, is not always black and white, or even easy. It may seem to some that Nick's desire to avenge the death of someone who died over 200 years ago, someone who belonged not to him, but the man whose memories he obtained, was pointless and didn't matter. But as long as someone cares, it will always matter.
see you looking round the corner. Come on inside and pull up a chair, 'cause I'm the one you're looking